So, anytime that we try to look over the horizon, it's going to be a matter of the best informed answer that we can give today. And that's what we're going to be working towards. Before we start trying to look forward, I want to take one quick second to look back, because the developments over the past decade have also been contributors to where we find ourselves today. And actually a little bit more than a decade ago, because really today began in 2011 when China decided to cut off Japan's access to rare earths. That was really sort of the beginning of what has become a stampede towards self-defined national security, self-sufficiency, economic security, mineral security, and a whole litany of other securities. So in the intervening time, the next significant event was COVID, in which the world suddenly awakened to the reality that the longer your supply chain, the more fragile it is. And that also has contributed to today's rush to try to define what is a acceptably secure supply chain for critical materials to underpin the development of national security in a host of countries and regions. So those are the two, I think, defining elements that have contributed significantly to today. And what do we find today? We find a geopolitical landscape in flux that has not been seen since World War II. And we are not actively engaged in a global war as classically defined. But I think we can argue, and this might be a good starting point, that we're engaged in a global economic war. A war for technological survival and supremacy, a war for minerals dominance, a war for the strong to say that they will survive. So I want to toss out sort of the first question along those lines. And I guess, Constantine, I want to start with you on this one. We hear a lot of different discussions around certain countries: Brazil, India, the United States, Canada. Let's just limit ourselves to those four for a moment. Among those four, which one, if any, appears to be pursuing a policy which will lead to success over the next decade in terms of the struggle as currently defined, i.e., ensuring their national security, the well-being of their people, and control of a critical minerals supply chain? Any one of those four on track?
Well, thanks, Mel. Given how unpredictable and opaque the rare earth industry is, and it has been for the last few decades, 3, 4, I think there's no guarantees of success. There's no magic bullets. There's no easy ways. It takes an awful lot of work. It takes smart strategies, both by companies and governments. And it takes an awful lot of hard work. So among those four that you mentioned, and I will lay my conflicts on the table because I have been advising the Brazilian Development Bank on its critical mineral strategy for the last year and a half. I really like what Brazil is doing. And I like what Brazil is doing for two reasons. First of all, they have tremendous resources. They're not easy to get out, but with the right technology and the right skills, and that they can, and that's why there's so much exploration and development activity going on in Brazil by Australians, Canadians, Americans. There's, I don't know if I'm divulging things that shouldn't be divulged, but there are conversations between governments and the Brazilian government, especially the American government and the Brazilian government, about coming up with a mechanism to ensure that Brazilian heavy rare earth resources make their way to into the United States. Perhaps you can look at it as part of the new great game, but the whole thing has been a great game of sorts. But what I like about Brazil, that they have really good resources, but they have a smart approach in terms of how BNDES, the development bank, is going about it. They've raised $1 billion fund, which by American standards is a pittance. But when you're dealing with junior miners that their existence is hand to mouth, it could go a long way. And that capital has come together both by the taxpayer, government funds, but also there's half of it is private. It's come from family offices, institutional investors, and more importantly, a couple $100 million of that has come from Vale, one of the more successful resource extraction companies in Brazil. So that capital has come together, and here's where I think Brazil did the right thing. It's not the Ministry of Mines and Energy. It's not a government agency that's managing how capital from this fund will be allocated to whoever they feel is deserving or politically connected or whatever. The fund is being managed by two arm's length financial institutions, private equity companies, whose job is to allocate capital wisely. Now, I don't know if there's any political interference in the background. This is way above my pay grade, but I think on the surface, this is the right way to go about it. Here's a pool of capital with public and private money, and here's two professional fund managers that will decide which projects and which companies merit, contributions from this capital, and that capital is going through the supply chain, through the capital structure. Some of it is grant, some of it is equity, some of it is debt. So I think this is a very smart and relatively novel, although pretty obvious way to go. We'll see how it plays out. Geopolitics these days, and as a Canadian, I raise my eyebrows on a daily basis with what I hear and what I see. But I think this is a smart way to go about it, with a commitment to the entire supply chain, all the way down to EVs and motors and magnets and so on. And starting with the right resources and a modest fund that can make companies' lives easier through that supply chain. We'll see.
Thanks, Constantine. Jack, I want to toss the follow-up question to you. Because this structure that you're outlining, Constantine, does sound very interesting. But Jack, how would you, if you were one of those individuals picking the companies to receive the capital, what would be your criteria, given that it's awfully hard in a niche characterized almost exclusively so far by junior companies to decide who can genuinely be a profitable producer and who cannot? Because presumably, as a member of that particular investment group, you want to make money back. You want to see a profitable company. How are you going to find the profitable company?
Competence, experience, prior success. Okay. You have so many junior companies where the individuals have no experience whatsoever of that aspect of critical minerals in which they're entering, and yet they get funded. And you see, you're talking about two different sources of funding. If you're talking about government, it's really clear that the national governments in the Northern Hemisphere have very little technical due diligence competence. Okay, they don't have any experience. And That's the big problem. Private equity seems to not be very interested in this space. Okay. And it's a very simple reason, isn't it? Because they need to know, they want to make money, profit. So they want to know when they're going to make the money. So the biggest metric they're concerned about is risk. Okay. And when I look at the companies that the United States government, for example, has awarded money to, I cannot believe they've done that. I don't see any companies with experienced people in them with a record of success. Okay. And I'd like to make a comment on your previous question. Okay. I'm sorry. You said Canada, Brazil, India. What was the fourth? I'm sorry, I don't recall.
United States.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The good old US of A.
Sorry. Okay. And I disagree with Constantine. I would pick India. Okay. And I have a simple reason. India has 20% of the world's people. They have 1.5 billion people. It has an enormous reservoir of engineers all across the engineering spectrum, chemical, electrical, mechanical, etc. It has the biggest untapped market in the world, 1.5 billion people that are living in a pretty low economy, right? Okay. Now, I know for a fact that Indian companies have been working on all aspects of the rare earth enabled product supply chain for as long as I can remember. Okay. Now, this is where I think the future is. And I know exactly what Constantine's going to say. Where are they going to get the rare earths? Well, they have a very large amount of heavy mineral sands. Okay. And in fact, they've been mining those for some time. For some reason, when everybody lists the separation plants in the world, the salt extraction plants, they always skip Kerala, which is an operating plant, which was funded, I believe, by Toyota and a company called Indian Rare Earth Limited. And it's certainly operational. And I note that the Indian government in the last few months has prohibited the export of finished rare earths. We in the industry, we all know that India now has two companies being built to provide rare earth metals and alloys. Many Indian companies make rare earth permanent magnets. Indian companies make a lot of little tiny cars, three-wheelers, for example, millions of them. Okay. I don't believe they're electric yet, but they'd like them to be. And yeah. I personally saw an Indian full-size mining truck, which was electric, built in India with rare earth permanent magnets. Okay. That's where I think it's going to happen because they have the most important ingredient. And, excuse me for being sexist, manpower. They have so many STEM graduates, it's ridiculous. Okay. And even it's incredible that everybody overlooks this huge deficit. A colleague of mine and I spoke over New Year's, and he said, I don't care how much money you allocate in Brazil, you can't find the people to build this industry. Okay. And as you know, the Chinese figured this out already. And you can talk about they're not going to export this, they're not going to export that. Guess what they're not going to export? People, technology, equipment. They know how to hurt us, and they're doing it.
An excellent point, Jack. I mean, it's what I call the knowledge gap. And of all the elements in the critical mineral supply chain, that is the one that takes the longest to develop. It takes longer to grow back knowledge than to build a mine in any country. So I take the fundamental importance of your point, but it makes me wonder, and this question is to both of you. Every country at the moment seems to be fixated on soup to nuts. Every country wants to have mine to metal and magnet and EV industry and this and that and the other thing. Can that model succeed? Because I would argue that it cannot. How many EVs does the world need? you look at, for instance, Saudi Arabia, one of the key elements of Plan 2030 is developing an electric vehicle industry. So why not, and is this possible, in this age of geopolitical separation and realignment? What do you think are the possibilities that over the next 10 years, structures like BRICS essentially collapse, but are replaced by new structures featuring specialization? So India specializes in contributing knowledge. Brazil and the DRC specialize in contributing copious high-grade minerals. Japan specializes, and South Korea in contributing the magnets, etc. Any possibility that in 10 years, that's the future that we see?
No. What you're looking at now is, everybody seems, because you've lived in an era of globalization. So you think that's the way things are. Okay. Globalization is this particular version of globalization is coming to an end, and the world is fracturing into regional and even national, focused powerhouses. No, I don't think that. Well, I think that India will have its own rare earth permanent. I don't want to say rare earth permanent, rare earth enabled materials industry. Japan is well on the way to developing external sources under their control, just as China's done for the last 25 years. They're picking the Chinese model. I believe in 10 years, America will be self-sufficient in what it needs in rare earths, because I don't think it needs that much rare earths. And I think we certainly have the quantities here we need, and we can redevelop the industry. The word reshoring is ridiculous. We're restarting. 25 years ago, we were only too glad to give up this industry. Now we're suddenly saying, well, we'll just bring it back. Well, it's like bringing back your teeth. They don't come back. Okay, and so you have to grow. You can't grow new ones. So what you do is you recreate the situation. Okay, you have a baby. You're going to see in 10 years, America will be self-sufficient, but it won't be exporting because our costs will be too high. Okay, and that's, to me, the future. I don't see re-globalization occurring in the near future, not at all. And I really do think that here's where I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't think, let's say, and I'm not going to name them, let's say there's half a dozen companies now vying to be major producers of rare earth products in the United States, domestic companies, okay? In my opinion, 10 years from now, there'll probably be one or maybe two, okay? Because you don't need all of these. One of the problems of subsidization is that you create too much material, okay? Because you don't have to worry about profit. So I'm going to start a rare earth company. Why not? I have nothing else to do today. Okay, because the government's going to make sure I make a profit. So a whole lot of financializers and, quite frankly, frauds get into that. And then it all comes with no subsidies. You watch and see just how many of these companies survive. Okay, and I'm telling you, it'll be just one or two, and that's all we need. Okay, because I'm sorry to disagree with you, Mel, but there's not going to be an EV revolution in American transportation.
I didn't necessarily say there would be, Jack. In fact, I implied the opposite. Constantine, what do you think?
Well, listen. The world is making, round numbers, 100 million vehicles a year. If we think that those vehicles will continue to be internal combustion engines for the next few generations, I wouldn't bet on that. Listen, I don't know what the future holds. All I know is that
we're here to guess about it, Constantine.
Right.
Guess about it.
Yeah, and I would guess that when I spend a lot of time going back and forth to China, and I've lost enough hair to have learned enough lessons. I've got the scars on my back. I wouldn't bet against the US and I wouldn't bet against China. But I think when it comes to critical minerals, critical materials, and development of supply chains using that depend on these critical materials. I think there's all kinds of lessons one needs to learn from China. And, if you want to accuse me of being whatever, fine. But I've seen China develop its industry from, farming rice, the majority of its people subsisting, to the time now where they're a major exporter. They hit the first $1 trillion export export surplus, and they make the best EVs in the world. A few months ago, I was in Beijing, and I was then again last week when the Canadian Prime Minister was in Beijing. And I make it a point of walking into EV dealerships. I was blown away by what you can buy for $40,000 in China. Think cars that look better than Mercedes-Benz, the feel and the performance is better than a Ferrari for $40,000. I will quote the Ford CEO who wrote an article at the beginning of the summer. I think it was the Wall Street Journal, but I may be wrong, where he wrote about the Xiaomi car that he had used. He had been driving for 6 months. He had it shipped from Shanghai to Chicago. And at the 6 months, when the car was supposed to go back, he didn't want to give it back. And he wrote an article saying this is the best car I have ever driven. The Ford company CEO, not me, not Jack, none of us, but what the Chinese have done with EVs is mind-boggling, and they should not be underestimated. So EVs are, the greatest, the fastest growing application for rare earths. And China, we've had this discussion before, and with Jack as well. And one exception I make to the narrative that says China dominates the rare earth industry or the production of rare earths in the world, etc. The next comment should always be China dominates production of rare earths because China dominates consumption of rare earths. So their industrial strategy has been focused on self-sufficiency of all the critical materials and technologies and skills that they need to continue driving their industry forward. And industrial strategy is something that has fallen way out of favor in the last few decades in our laissez-faire liberal economics, which is fine. But the other exception I'll take to my friend Jack's comments is globalization could also be a force for good under certain parameters, of course, because I'll refer to your earlier comment about the previous rare earth crisis when China embargoed rare earth exports to Japan for 7 weeks. The reason, again, I lived through it because I had a couple of containers of my nano-structured high-purity dysprosium oxide that was going to Japan. I had those containers stuck at Shanghai port. And those containers were going to a Japanese client of mine with whom we had worked for 5 years to develop this material that was allowing them to produce extremely tiny and extremely powerful multi-layer ceramic capacitors. You look at your phone, there's about 800 of these tiny little chips in the average smartphone. And when you talk about computers and screens, all kinds of electronics, the numbers go up from there. When the Japanese, who were the only suppliers of these chips and these components, stopped shipping them back to China, the assembly factories of all the electronic industry in the Dongguan to Shenzhen corridor shut down. 150,000 people were out on the street. Beijing calls them and says, calls Shanghai customs and says, get these rare earths back into Japan. So, there's a maxim that says that countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other, which I believe is valid. But I think I'm very pessimistic about the world falling back on mercantilism that seemed to work 200 years ago. But I think it's an outdated idea. It doesn't work beyond certain time, and perhaps serving some very narrow interests. But the world is much better off when we have free trade. The other thing I'm going to say, the crisis ended, the last crisis, not this one, because we had a functioning WTO. In 2015, the WTO, after a 2-year process, found against China's export controls. The Obama administration, together with Mexico and the EU, with Canada as an observer, filed a complaint in the WTO about China's export controls. The WTO said it was illegal. What did China do? It eliminated its export controls. It abided by the WTO decision. And what happened next? Prices collapse, Molycorp files for bankruptcy, and prices have stayed in the last decade low enough for all the rare earth buyers in the world, primarily automotive, to forget about the need to control supply chains, the need for resilient supply chains. And of course, it was on this crisis, again, with a trade war across the world, that prices started going up. Questions of security and resiliency popped up again. And now we're scrambling to try to control things that it will take decades. I totally agree with Jack. In 2010, in a conversation behind closed doors with the Department of Defense, I said to them, it's taken 2 decades for the supply chains to migrate away from North America into China and Asia. It'll take at least 2 decades for them to come back. If you spend crazy money and if you focus, maybe you can do it in a decade. However, what you need to remember is that you start now, you'll get there in 10 years. However, we didn't start until 10 years later or 15 years later. So we seem to forget about what matters every time that little crisis goes away. Henry Kissinger said, never let a crisis go to waste. I think we've let too many crises go to waste, and now we're scrambling. And with every new crisis, it's going to get more difficult and much more expensive to close the gap. So here we are.
I want to pick up on a couple of thoughts that you have articulated, and one that's implicit in what you said, Jack, about American self-sufficiency and how self-sufficiency might apply to other countries in the world. Because it strikes me as, particularly when I think about EVs in America, the big choke point so far is energy, not enough charging stations. China obviously has that situation under control. Other countries are working it in different ways and at different rates. But energy is going to be a choke point that countries will face universally. It's here in the United States with an antiquated energy grid, current policies that oppose diversification of generation sources. The trade in energy, it strikes me, will also be potentially weaponized and or potentially will limit the capacity of countries to attain this mercantilist vision of self-sufficiency. So as we look across this arc of time towards 10 years in the future, if we can't obtain self-sufficiency, how will nations interact? In a mercantilist scenario, the strong will feed on the weak. In a free trade scenario, cooperative structures emphasizing what you do best as contributing to the supply chain could emerge. So I'm going to come back at both of you on this point, looking 10 years down the road with today's tendencies and issues like energy and human capital and the pure presence of what materials do you have? I mean, let's face it, plenty of NdPr running around, a lot less heavies. So taking those kind of factors into account, what is the world that we're heading toward? Is it more mercantilist in fundamental nature, or is it going to retreat to a modified form of free trade? maybe minus some of those organizations that played a stabilizing role. I want to provoke the two of you to give me some guesses about where these trend lines are going to take us.
I have a comment. It's going to be mercantile. I'll tell you why. China, for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, has been developing their Belt and Road Initiative, where they've lent $1 trillion to countries on their periphery, and some in Africa and even some in South America. Okay, fine. Now, they knew ahead of time, they're not stupid, that those countries could never pay back those loans. So what do? They say, well, you can't pay back the loan, Pakistan, on the new port we built in your country. Therefore, we own the port, we'll run it, of course, for our mutual benefit. What they've done is recreate the British Empire with a hell of a lot more organization and skill. Okay? Now, they will not need us. They will have this enormous internal Belt and Road empire of consumption. Okay? I disagree entirely on EVs. I want to make a point. China doesn't have any oil. It's good reason, but it has a lot of coal, and they import a lot of oil as long as they can. Okay, and they import and use uranium, and so they are building in the last. I just saw a note that in the last year they've added as much electrical generation as the United States has. Okay, that they've added. Okay, think about something. And Mel, you made a point, and I want to elaborate on it. The word critical is a derivative of the word crisis. Keep those in mind. They go together. Okay. Now, in America, we're suddenly going to build hundreds of billions of dollars of electrical generation plants to take care of AI, right? And let's see, we're going to add EV drains, and we're going to add all this demand for electricity, but we're going to limit ourselves on how we produce electricity. God forbid we should do it by emitting carbon dioxide. So we're going to do every stupid thing we can, and we're going to. I was at a lecture at the Royal Society in London a few years ago, and with a friend of mine, they were inaugurating the youngest member that ever had, and he was saying he had calculated that if you cover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico with solar cells, you could provide enough power for that part of the United States. He said he doubted very much they were going to do that because the people might object to living under solar cells. Okay, none of this can happen. It's all financial nonsense. Okay, just churning finance is what it is. You cannot. We have more oil. We have all the oil we need. It provides us with the lowest cost energy in the world. So we should, of course, not do that. And we should have electric cars where we don't have the grid to sustain them. No, I believe you live in Wyoming. Is that correct?
Yes.
No? Okay. So are you able to drive an electric car across the vast state of Wyoming and recharge it? Tell me, I'm serious.
No. Right now, the local legislature in Wyoming passed a law that says no one's allowed to build recharging stations in the state of Wyoming.
Oh, okay. So
that's why I'm laughing, Jack. I'm not laughing at your question.
No, it's a political. What I'm saying is everybody thinks about economics without politics. Politics is devastating to economics because by the way, it was Rahm Emanuel who said never let a crisis go to waste. Okay, and he has now announced he's thinking of running for president of the United States. That'll be a real crisis. Okay, and so look, we keep talking about a small industry. The rare earth industry is a very small industry. Okay, and it's not. We can live without it. Okay, I know. God forbid I should say this, right? I know people can get mad at me. Okay, but does anyone remember phones used to be wired into the wall? They worked just fine. Okay, and I actually am the last person you're ever going to meet in your life who was in the manufacturing of cathode ray tubes, big ones for the military. Okay. And today that 400-pound 32-inch tube is replaced by a 10-pound, let's say, flat screen. Okay. And that's because of modern technology, chips, phosphorus, rare earths, things like that. But guess what? The tube machines work just fine. So
see, there I would have to take an issue with you, Jack. I love my cell phone. But anyway, Constantine, you were leaning forward, lean into the question. Where are we going with this? Mercantilism, global warfare? Where?
The idea of the world going back to mercantilism will result in a Dickensian at best and perhaps a Hobbesian world, which most of us don't want to be part of. I think human nature and human intellect has developed beyond those ideals. And I think eventually sane heads will prevail and we will return. You got to be an optimist. I think this continuing dysfunctionality will not last and cannot last if we have any faith in the human race and the human condition. So that's the high level stuff. Lower down, you asked about energy. And I think energy, what has been happening to the supply and the consumption of energy over the last decade or so is the result of humans coming to the conclusion that climate change is real, although in certain circles is considered a hoax. So the majority of the world still believes in science that says that climate change is real. And if we think that we can decarbonize our energy infrastructure, both consumption and production without nuclear, I think I'd like to smoke some of that stuff too. I think the answer is nuclear even for countries that don't have their own access to hydrocarbons to generate energy that way. And, I don't disagree with Jack. Solar and wind are not for everybody, but under the right circumstances, they have a role to play. It's not a universal panacea, but they do. I think eventually you will see an energy infrastructure that has nuclear as a large chunk. It still has some hydrocarbon generated power under certain circumstances, and it will have its own fill of solar and wind where it makes sense and it doesn't offend the sensibilities of the President of the United States, perhaps. However, it will be a collection of different modes of power generation. I think the drive towards energy efficiency will continue because we need to have a much lower energy consumption footprint, whether it's our refrigerators, our cars, or whatever. And the only way to get there is with better, more efficient motors, hence rare earth magnets in those motors. So yeah, I'm still a bit of an optimist. I don't think we're destined to go back to the Industrial Revolution days. And there's no question, mercantilism created certain states and was really good in the early parts of the British Industrial Revolution. It helped the United States in between wars and certainly after the Second World War. But eventually, the world became a better place when we started trading a little freer with each other. Is the system perfect? Of course not. However, I think the international world order will return at some point, perhaps not with the institutions that we're all familiar with, but there is room for new institutions that reflect the new realities. But mercantilism, I don't think that dog will hunt for very long. I think for a few years, for a few election cycles, perhaps, but long term, it doesn't make sense to be the surviving economic model of the next generation.
Well, I hope you're right, but I have to say, when you so glibly say for a few election cycles, suddenly we're talking a decade. So essentially speaking, you might be saying, without necessarily intending to say it, that mercantilism will define this next decade that we're looking toward, and that therefore companies and investors need to view the world in that way and invest in and bet on the strongest and most capable countries, because those will be the winners in the mercantile system, because they will eat the weak. Another thing that I would point out is that in a mercantile system, with the inherent rise of strong and weak, there's an opportunity for a genuine realignment of power nodes. So I'd like to bring in the Middle East and Central Asia at this point and get your thoughts on the potential of those areas. I mean, the kingdom is much in the news because of Plan 2030, and of course, the Future Minerals Forum that some of us attended recently. And being a nation governed by a young man with a vision in a hurry who wants to surpass the achievement of his grandfather who founded a nation. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that the prince has a vision for Saudi, and he's driving relentlessly towards it, and including vast social change that I think can reshape the Middle East. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Iran is on fire again right now. And there's old ties between the Middle East and Central Asia that could be very interesting. Think back to Silk Road and Spice Road. So is there a possible shift of global power away from the West? The EU and the United States are drifting apart to all appearances. Canada is striking out on its own. Mexico would naturally go with Latin America in this mercantilist scenario. So is smart money on the Middle East and Central Asia then as emerging victors over the next decade?
Well, I can take that first, Jack, if you don't mind. Some of the smart money, yes. I would say some resource extraction in Central Asia, but Central Asia is still very close to Russia and on the Silk Road that China is recreating through its Belt and Road. So it would be rather challenging for the West to control access to those resources in Central Asia. Saudi Arabia and the Middle East is very different. What's going on in Saudi Arabia is remarkable. Now, as we have seen the last few days, some of the really ambitious projects are being pulled back because some of them perhaps they shouldn't have started at all. But when it comes to industrial expansion in Saudi Arabia, the Plan 2030 under MBS is real. There's real money being spent, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is committed to having automotive production. They bought, or they're the largest investor in Lucid, which makes car EVs in the kingdom, and you see an awful lot of them. I'm sure, Mel, you saw them at the Future Minerals Forum ferrying people around.
Yeah, and they were also at one of my round tables. Yeah.
Hyundai is either very close or they've already made the decision to build EVs in the kingdom. And Mohammed bin Salman has mandated Ma'aden, who I advise, again, conflicts on the table, on the development of a rare earth project in Saudi Arabia, a mine, coupled with a rare earth refinery that the Department of War has financed MP's 50% JV interest in, and the Public Investment Fund, the largest investor in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
$1 trillion, I think, under assets, yeah.
They've been mandated to build a magnet facility, metal alloy and magnet facility. Now, given how much money they can put on the table, I wouldn't bet against them. There will be teething pains and disappointments and difficulties and so on. But if the Crown Prince is determined to get there fairly soon, I think they'll get there one way or another. So Saudi Arabia is reimagining itself. I don't know if it will be a major global power beyond oil, but I think what they're doing makes sense for their people and their economy. So I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years down the road, um, Saudi Arabia has remade itself into something a lot more modern, a lot more Western, both socially and perhaps more importantly, industrially. Southeast
Jack,
Asia.
you have some thoughts too?
Point is, the Chinese have publicly approached the Saudis and said they'd like to use RMB, their currency, to buy the oil. Okay. Now their currency is not convertible, and there's a lot of reasons that it's not a reserve currency. Okay, but the point is, China is today the world's greatest manufacturing nation, largest in terms of output. Okay. And they're saying to the Saudis right now, we'll buy your oil with our currency. Okay. Then you can use that currency to buy goods in our country, which means that the Chinese are saying, would you like to join the Belt and Road Initiative? I'm using that term. You know, they're not going to, China's not going to lend money to Saudi, and Saudi's not going to take it. But this is their best chance for the Chinese to get their currency out into their empire. Okay. And the others have already, of course, when they lend, I guess the RMB is 7-to-1 on the dollar on the open market. So if they lend billions of RMB to Nigeria, okay, they expect Nigeria to use that Chinese currency to buy goods, and they do. They buy infrastructure, railroads, cheap goods, expensive goods, machines. And to me, this is how the Chinese are doing it. They like, I'm back to mercantilism. They like mercantilism. They can see how it works for. Remember, little tiny Great Britain was the major power in gigantic China for a century. Okay, and the Chinese say, you know what, we can do it too, and that's what they're up to. Now, I'm not criticizing them. I'm not judging them. I'm saying I think that nations of the world are individual power centers. I don't think they want to help each other. I think everybody wants advantage. Okay. And China has done a fantastic job in the last 30 years about outsmarting us. They have learned how to control their environment. They are now almost the equal economically of the West. And I've never believed for a minute that the Chinese want to control California, okay, or that they want New Jersey as part of Sichuan province. I think what they'd like is for us to. I think their history says, leave us alone, stay away from us, okay, and they are creating that world for themselves. They've done a very good job. We've been asleep. We said, gee, we're going to bring them into why they're going to elect Donald Trump as their next president. But you know what? They got the same guy. They got Xi Jinping. He's the same guy, except he has a chemical engineering degree, and he has a lot more understanding of some of these things than the president does. Okay, I'm going to stop my rant. I'm just saying, I don't see globalization coming back at all.
Well, because of time, I'm going to say that this is likely the last question. And I have to say that although I'm optimistic, Constantine, I very much fear that mercantilism is the answer over the next decade, at least. But here's the point that I'm making. These mercantilist countries that were a success, like Great Britain, like Portugal, like Spain, what were they also characterized as? Great military powers.
Mm-hmm.
They established and held control of what they considered vital resources through their military capabilities. I don't think it's a coincidence that China and the United States and Saudi Arabia with M35s, etc. Suddenly everyone is interested in armaments and rearming and building it out. Tungsten, titanium, cesium, rare earths, goes far beyond EVs. Right now, defense is a very slender strand in a very narrow niche. If we are looking at a mercantilist decade, defense spending is going to increase. The winners are going to be in the defense-related industries and in the mines. So again, coming back to the new geopolitical landscape and thinking of today, who produces military equipment and who's going to be demanding the materials relevant to the production of military equipment and where those minerals are currently located. Are we talking about perhaps some forced political realignments in order to secure defense superiority? And if so, who are the winners? Aside from the United States and China, those are so obvious, we're not going to talk about them. But Constantine, I mean, what about Brazil as a military projection power? What about Saudi? What about Canada?
Well, that's a really loaded question, Mel.
Thank you.
For the record, you cannot build an industrial rare earth supply chain on the back of demand by the military alone. If you look at the numbers, less than 2% of global rare earth demand goes into defense applications. In the United States today, there isn't sufficient demand by defense contractors for rare earths to baseload a single facility. And I would be happy to get into the false narrative of 920 pounds of rare earth metals per F-35, which is complete and total bunk that serves the interest.
Jack's head nodding too.
The number is less than 50 for the record, and it comes from the horse's mouth. We'll leave that aside. So we can't build an industrial supply chain on false narratives. However, it's a very powerful industrial player. I mean, let's face it, since the Second World War, the military-industrial complex was the de facto industrial strategy for the United States and a few others, Russia, for example, Soviet Union, sorry. But I think what needs to be done, as long as the civilian demand is there, the defense industry, the defense industrial base will be the beneficiary of that. But, if you're asking for defense to build and sustain a supply chain on rare earths and other critical minerals, I'm afraid we'll be back into the area and the age of golden hammers and golden toilets and things like that. I don't want to be flippant, but in terms of volumes, there just isn't enough demand to justify spending the kinds of billions that we are committing to rare earth supply chains just for defense. I mean, in the last few months, we've had subsidies to create 40,000 tons of magnet production in the United States. Where? Who's going to buy all that stuff? What are we talking about? But anyways, I won't pontificate on that. However, we need to also realize that we are continuing to be asleep at the switch because, where is some of our high performance aluminum and titanium that is used by Boeing and other defense contractors? It's still coming from Russia. Right? Why are we not addressing real defense problems and instead we're sort of wasting time and treasure on things that are perhaps critical, that are critical, but perhaps not as critical. So, in terms of, Europe has committed to spend more money on defense. German defense contractors are doing quite well in the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister, has committed the country to spending 5% of GDP on defense over the next, until the next decade. And as long as the priorities are done right and Canada is smart about it, Canada can use 5% of GDP spent on defense on the right things and helping its own industrial capabilities. And listen, if the Italians can build a bridge to Sicily and justify it as defense spending, I'm sure there's an awful lot of things we can do in the rest of the world and call it defense related. So, yeah, I think that will be a component of industrial expansion. Rare earths will be part of it, no question about it. However, defense demand by itself is not going to be sufficient to sustain the defense industrial base, the industrial base that is associated with industrial expansion across the board. Brazil, I don't know. I haven't heard the word defense in Brazil as being part of their priorities. I think they will be happy to do a deal with Europe and the United States and perhaps even others like Canada to be able to sell their rare earths to these industrial economies for defense purposes. But I don't see the Brazilians building F-35s and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles and things like that. So I think the major defense producers, equipment producers like the United States, will continue. China, Europe will go on, and Russia, of course, will continue to build what Chomsky said. They continue to invest in the manufacturing of waste, hopefully waste, as long as you don't have to use it. So yeah, we will see continuing focus on it and the justification of mercantilism in the name of defense requirements. Yeah, we're in the next decade will be odd. It will be painful. I think it will hurt Canada, especially over the next 2, 3 years in particular. But hopefully, saner heads will prevail, and industry and global trade will come back to more sane levels. So, over to you, Jack.
Yeah, just one quick old man story. Okay, I was actually in Japan the day that the Chinese and Japan had that dust up on the islands. Okay, and that caused them the Chinese to stop exporting. I was at a meeting of MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Technology, with the minister. Okay, and they during our meeting, some aide came in and whispered in his ear, and he said, "God damn, I remember this." Okay, he said those effing generals and admirals, they think they're running the show. He said, "This will blow over. Don't worry about it." I will never forget that meeting. Okay, he was wrong, and those effing generals and admirals have a lot of influence. But Constantine is absolutely correct. The military demand is trivial, but Wall Street and the City of London have decided that, my God, an F-35 has half a ton of rare earth. Of course, that means it's not carrying any weapons. It's just carrying that half ton of rare earth. Okay. And so, therefore, we need the 40,000 tons of magnets he's talking about. And the simple issue in America that's not addressed is, what is the actual demand right now? What will it be in 10 years? So if the demand is 20,000 tons, why are we talking about 40,000 tons? But nobody wants to address this. See, they'll say it's going to be infinite. Every family will have 3 electric cars. We'll have a wind turbine for every person in the United States. We will need 1 billion tons, blah, 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 blah. All nonsense. No, just tell me what's the demand, and then tell me how your company is going to compete in that demand arena. We don't hear that, do we? We hear we must do this or it's the end of our way of life. this is nonsense.
Thank you, gentlemen, both very much. Like I said, Constantine, I'm an optimist. My heart is with you, but I think my head is with the mercantilism argument, I'm afraid. So, bottom line, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to be an interesting ride. Put your money where the strong possibilities are, and then hang on tight. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good rest of your days.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.